Hi there, Michaela here, and today I'm presenting my research on traditional healing's role in preventing suicide in boarding school students affected by historical trauma. On the agenda today, we will be going over my research question, a brief literature review, methodology, and my reflective question. So historical trauma is a form of multi-generational trauma that has been a topic of increasing awareness throughout the last few years. This is primarily due to the education of the masses on effects of historical events such as relocation, slavery, genocide, and colonialism. There are specific communities that are greatly affected by historical trauma. For the study, I will be focusing on Native American or Indigenous people, specifically young students currently attending boarding schools. In many rural Native American communities, the only way to attain an education is to leave the community in which they grew up. This is a form of assimilation still used today. To answer the research question of my research, which is how effective is traditional healing at preventing suicide in students affected by historical trauma? So here's a brief literature review of 4 different articles that I've read in my research. So we'll start with learning from those who do land-based healing in a Muskogee community. The target population for the study is Aboriginal communities within the territory, and it aims to understand Indigenous communities' thoughts about land-based healing. This research was done through group conversations between 3 participants of the same community, the facilitator, and 2 assistants. The meetings usually lasted about 2 hours, and then the audio recordings were transcribed and analyzed qualitatively to identify apparent themes. Um, this referred to the key components of land-based interventions. The second theme would be the challenges in offering land-based interventions, and the third was the transfer of knowledge regarding land-based interventions. The participants were then asked to come back and look at the data for inconsistencies, omissions, and other misinterpretations, and the results were as follows. Land-based healing bridges disconnections from language, culture, spirituality, and elders. It looks to create connections to the land, to elders, and the community, as well as oneself. Land-based work includes working together, talking circles, teaching, talking, and learning traditional skills and songs. For the second question, cost and funding are challenges for land-based work, as well as liability concerns, restrictions, and collaboration between natural healers and mental health/addiction professionals. Furthermore, one of its aims is to challenge the language gap between youth and elders, and transferring knowledge requires demonstration, teamwork, and leadership skills. For the second article, Indigenous Roots and Family-Run Land-Based Healing in Northern Ontario, the target population was Indigenous family-run land-based programs. To study this, researchers interviewed one representative named Alex from a territory in Northern Ontario. The study was qualitative and had idiographic components, and it is identified as integrating Indigenous and Western approaches and is therefore named the two-eyed approach. The following 3 open-ended questions were asked. 1, what is the critical components of land-based interventions? 2, what are the challenges in offering land-based interventions? And 3, what are the main steps in transferring knowledge about land-based interventions? Keywords and phrases that were found were placed into 3 different categories, including the key components of land-based interventions, 2, the challenges of offering land-based interventions, 3, the transfer of knowledge regarding land-based interventions, and 4, any aspects not already categorized within the preceding 3 categories. Alex was brought in again to review the data to ensure that there were no inconsistencies, omissions, or incorrect interpretations. And the data was categorized into those 3 categories. He spoke about the loss of coming of age rituals that were once an integral part of raising children, and this was all to prepare them for life on the land and the world and to make them self-reliant. Land-based programs work to integrate learning and engaging in traditional outdoor activities while including time for storytelling and sharing. There's also a vital spiritual component to land-based ventures, and Alex believes that we take care of the land, and so it must be reciprocated. 2 challenges surrounding expansion included obstacles at the organizational level, such as denial of proposals and invoices. Often families must pay out of pocket for these trips as a result, and land-based healing could have more of an impact if funding was secured. Alex trains others in land-based practices through taking the person along, knowing that they won't remember everything, but will gain a better understanding through watching. And for the fourth category, Alex states that land-based healing works because it acknowledges the nomadic history and the spiritual connection to the land. For my third article, it goes over the risk factors for suicide among adolescent Indian students at a boarding school. The sample contained 188 high school students attending an Indian boarding school, and this was a longitudinal study. The study aimed to shed light on stressful events, coping mechanisms, social support, self-esteem, and their effects on the population symptoms of depression, anxiety, and substance use. This survey was administered twice each academic year simultaneously and followed the students from enrollment to the end of their high school careers. Their risk of suicide potential was gathered through two questions. Have you ever tried to kill yourself? And how often in the past month have you thought of suicide? Students were also asked if a close family member or friend had attempted suicide, and the researchers gathered three different items of life events, stressful life events, and measured the students' experience with the death of a sibling, parent, or friend related to these stressful events. So a Pearson R test was conducted, and it was found that 23.4% reported having attempted suicide at some point, 20.9% of the population had thought of suicide within the past month, and 9.6% would have liked to kill themselves, and 2.8% would have killed themselves if they had the chance. It was found that there's a strong relationship between relatives and friends who had committed suicide or attempted suicide and the student's attempt and current risk. Depression symptoms were also strongly related to past suicide attempts and the present risk for suicide. The measure of possible diagnosis for depression was strongly related to past attempts as well as the current risk, and higher rates of alcohol use were positively related to suicide attempts. The number of stressful events was only marginally related to suicide risk, and little family support was related with attempted suicide, while high peer support was linked to greater current suicide risk. For my final article, trauma, historical trauma, PTSD, and suicide in American Indian community sample, the target population was American Indian communities, and the goal was to study the associations between perceived historical trauma, current traumatic events, diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, and suicidal behaviors in an American Indian community sample. To do this, 477 participants were recruited from 8 different reservations, and the data was analyzed based on the 3 aims of the study. 1, to describe the associations of historical trauma and associated symptoms assessed by the historical loss scale and historical loss associated symptom scale with suicide thoughts and actions. 2, to study the relationship of current traumatic events and the diagnosis of PTSD with suicidal thoughts and acts. 3, to describe the concurrent associations between feelings of historical loss and PTSD with suicidal thoughts and acts. And the results were as follows. The Pearson chi-squared tests were conducted, and it was found that 51% of the individuals reported no lifetime of suicidal thoughts or acts, 19.5% reported suicidal ideation or plans, 13.6% reported suicidal acts. The measure of historical loss was not associated with either suicidal acts or suicidal thoughts, but historical loss associated symptoms, while not associated with suicide, were significantly associated with suicidal acts. Aim 2 was conducted with a chi-squared test and a logistic regression. 94% of the participants reported experiencing one of the 7 traumas included in the study, and after limiting the exposure to those who had experienced assault, there was a significant association with suicidal thoughts and suicidal acts. It was also found that participants with a lifetime of PTSD were compared with no PTSD diagnosis were found to have significantly more suicidal thoughts and suicidal acts. Finally, the assault or trauma and PTSD were placed into a logistic regression model, which adjusted for gender, and neither gender nor associative trauma was associated with suicidal thoughts or acts, while PTSD remained a predictor for suicidal thoughts and acts. For the third aim, using a logistic regression, it was determined that current associations between historical loss, associated symptoms, gender, and PTSD with suicidal thoughts and acts. Individuals with PTSD were more likely to report suicidal thoughts, and there were no associations of suicidal thoughts with historical loss associated symptoms or female gender. And individuals with PTSD were more likely to have engaged in suicidal acts. This was similar to individuals with higher scores on the loss associated symptoms scale. So an overview of my research design and concept operationalization. I chose to do a qualitative design, and it was a causal design, longitudinal, and done through self-assessment surveys. Um, it was used primarily through the historical loss scale and associated symptoms, and also used the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale. And my target population was Native American boarding school students in the Southwest that were funded by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And this study would follow them from when they initially started high school to the end of their high school careers. And these students would participate in traditional healing activities such as language classes and ceremonies. After the data would be gathered, I would run a Pearson's R correlation test to determine if there was any statistically significant correlation between suicide risk and levels of historical trauma perceived and its associated symptoms, as well as the length of time that the student was involved in the traditional healing methods. So the population that I wish to study is the typical high school Native American boarding school student within the Southwest. I chose the student population of the graduating class of 2027 through the process of enumeration. Random selection for the longitudinal study would prove to be difficult as the students may not be grouped together and easily accessible to participate in the study upon graduation or when the student leaves the boarding school. This poses an external validity problem as there will be no random sampling to make it harder to generalize to a larger population, such as all Native American boarding school students within the United States, but the advantage would be gaining a larger participant group size. So my variables would be historical loss, which would be a dependent variable. It has 12 different multiple choice items. And on the first scale, people indicate how often they think about 12 different types of loss. And responses range from several times a day, daily, weekly, monthly, yearly, and only at special times, and never. They were all scored 1 through 6, and the topics were loss of land, loss of language, loss of culture, loss of traditional spiritual ways, loss of family ties because of boarding schools, loss of families because of government relocation, loss of self-respect because of poor treatment by the government and officials, loss of trust in whites because of broken treaties, loss due to the effects of alcoholism, loss of people due to early death, loss of respect for elders, and loss of respect for traditional ways. The associated symptoms scale required respondents to indicate how often they experienced 12 different emotional states because of their consciousness of these losses. The states included anger, sadness, anxiety, shame, rage, fear, mistrust, isolation, avoidance, loss of concentration, loss of sleep, discomfort around white people, and feeling that past losses are all happening all over again. Participants were asked to score how often they feel these emotions from 5 responses, 1 through 5, including never, seldom, sometimes, often, or always. And suicide risk was my dependent variable. Finally, suicide risk would be measured using the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale, which is widely used throughout many applications of research and in clinical settings. I chose this as a frame of reference to make the study's results easier to compare with other studies involving suicidality. But one disadvantage of using this is that the methodology does not consider cultural subtext of Native American populations or any minority populations. And this could affect my study's results as it is not as culturally competent as I would like it to be, especially when there are hidden subtexts when discussing suicide with Native populations. For example, in some cultures, it's a taboo topic, which might be better suited to a qualitative approach, such as interviews, as mentioned in the literature review. But with a sample size this large, it would be hard to do with limited resources. And finally, my traditional healing variable would be my independent variable. Traditional healing would be administered through an outside company such as First Nations Community Health Center, and it would consist of involving students with their own culture and language as well as ceremonies. All students participating in the study would be involved with traditional healing, therefore it would be an independent variable. For my limitations, I mentioned a few of them throughout the PowerPoint here, but there are some significant ones, such as only studying one graduating class of a singular boarding school. So the results might not be generalizable to everybody that I would like it to. Some researchers have shown that historical trauma does not coincide with many different other variables, but instead it is key to look at the associated symptoms when comparing historical trauma. And finally, more certainly not being certain over whether or not the suicide risk and historical trauma are affected by the traditional healing methods could be attained through using protests. And here is my reflection question. What other applications of traditional healing do you believe would be beneficial to Native American/Indigenous populations? And here are my references.